All right, let's jump right into this explainer. You know, when we usually talk about the 2026 West Bengal Assembly elections, the focus naturally shifts to those big state-level political heavyweights and the massive national narratives. But today, we're doing something a bit different. We're unpacking what we call the Darjeeling paradox. We're looking right past all that political posturing to see the election in the hills entirely through the eyes of the people who actually live there.
So, this brings us to a really core question, right? Is the world's most famous tea town actually thriving? I mean, ask anyone around the globe, and they instantly picture the classic postcards, the Queen of the Hills, the misty mountains, those serene landscapes. But to genuinely understand this upcoming election, we have to look way beyond those glossy images and ask ourselves what daily life is actually like for the locals living there right now. Because to tourists, Darjeeling is literally a picture-perfect postcard. You've got the UNESCO World Heritage toy train, the world-class tea estates, those absolutely breathtaking views of Kanchenjunga. But step off that tourist trail for just a minute and the local reality is jarring. We're talking untreated sewage, severe daily water shortages, and a town that is heavily reliant on infrastructure dating all the way back to 1835. It is a completely different picture when you're living there year-round.
Part 1. Crumbling civic infrastructure.
Take a second and try to wrap your head around this staggering number, 350,000. Back in the British era, the main water reservoir in Darjeeling was built to serve a tiny population of just 7,000 people. Today, especially during the peak tourist season, that exact same infrastructure is forced to serve up to 3.5 lakh people. That is just a massive, completely unsustainable strain on basic resources.
And this huge infrastructure deficit, well, it just compounds into multiple daily crises. Residents are dealing with untreated sewage flowing directly into local rivers, which is actually infecting the water supply all the way down to Siliguri. Then you have these incredibly narrow roads causing absolute gridlock traffic, mostly because tourists bring cars into areas that were simply never built for them. Plus, there is practically zero solid waste management.
The frustration on the ground is just palpable. Ajoy Edwards, who is a local politician and a resident, puts it pretty bluntly. He says it's a glorified slum today. Wow, that is a real emotional punch, isn't it? It perfectly captures the heartbreak of a resident watching their beloved, historically beautiful town just decay, basically surviving on the fumes of century-old British infrastructure.
Which brings us to Part 2, Youth, Jobs, and Healthcare.
Now, this next part is arguably the most heartbreaking reality of this whole infrastructure gap. A young resident named Malvika shared the tragic story of a girl named Yuden from a remote village in the hills. Because there was no proper road access, the nearest hospital was a 4-hour walk away. Tragically, Yuden died on the way. It really highlights how a lack of basic roads isn't just some minor inconvenience. It is, quite literally, a matter of life and death.
Then there's the economic reality. 220 rupees. That is the daily wage of a worker in the world-famous Darjeeling tea gardens. And keep in mind, that wage is earned after 9 grueling hours of intense physical labor.
The disparity here is honestly shocking. A worker plucking the world's most premium tea earns 220 rupees for a full 9-hour day. Meanwhile, locals are quick to point out that a coolie at a train station, like Sialda, can easily earn 300 to 400 rupees for just 15 minutes of work carrying luggage. It's absolutely no wonder some locals heartbreakingly dub it blood tea. They feel their sweat and blood are being poured into an industry that just flat out doesn't pay a fair living wage.
So ask yourself, what happens to the youth in an environment like this? Well, you get a massive brain drain. Educated youth are practically forced to leave the hills because there's a severe lack of local academic opportunities, skill development programs, or even entrepreneurship platforms to help build local businesses. To make matters even worse, residents report that getting local work often relies heavily on political nepotism. Basically, you only get a job if you're holding the flag of the political party currently in power.
Nitesh, a resident there, sums up the mood perfectly. He says, it's just a waiting game. Generations have lost out. For 20 long years, they've heard all these political promises of change and development that just never materialize. The deep frustration of all that lost time and lost potential is immense.
Moving right along to Part 3, a visionary urban master plan.
But here's the crucial takeaway. The citizens of Darjeeling aren't just sitting around complaining. They are actively demanding real solutions. They have a very clear idea of what a master plan should look like to finally drag the town past its 1835 origins. They're demanding comprehensive water management, a major shift to sustainable hiking tourism, an overhauled traffic and transport system, and, crucially, strict environmental protection to save their incredibly fragile hills.
They've actually mapped out a brilliant, citizen-led strategy for tourism. Step 1. Move beyond the old, super-congested 7 to 8 tourist points. Step 2. Promote offbeat hiking and walking trails to spread out the footfall. And Step 3. Shift the entire focus toward attracting high-value, sustainable tourism rather than just overwhelming volume. It is a really smart way to relieve infrastructure pressure while still boosting the local economy.
And you know, residents just look right next door to Sikkim and they see 30 years of rapid, structured development. Then they look back at their own home in Darjeeling and see 3 decades of political stagnation and decaying infrastructure. This stark contrast really sets up their ultimate demand for visionary leadership.
Just listen to this passionate demand from Malvika. A leader needs to love their people. You're willing to even die for them. That is an incredibly powerful call to break down the corrupt political systems of the past. It's a demand for genuine, selfless leaders who actually care about the future of the hills, rather than just clinging to their own power.
And that leads us perfectly into Part 4, the vote for peace. You see, the Darjeeling Hills have a pretty turbulent history when it comes to statehood agitations. The 1980s saw a really violent struggle leading up to the DGHC formation. Protests then reignited in 2007, and by 2017, massive strikes had completely shut down the hills. But largely over this last decade, they have experienced a hard-won, incredibly precious period of peace.
And as one 49-year-old resident states absolutely clearly, peace is non-negotiable. For the generation who actually lived through the intense strikes of '86, this current era of peace is the mandatory foundation for everything else. You can't have tourism, you can't have entrepreneurship, and you definitely can't have progress without it.
So as we look at the landscape for the 2026 polls, we're seeing an incredibly intense 3-way contest between the BJP, the BGPM, and the IGJF. But what's truly remarkable here is the high voter enthusiasm we're expecting. A special intensive revision of the electoral rolls has actually prompted many residents who had moved away to return home specifically to cast their ballots. It's a completely citizen-driven, neutral demand for local progress and long-term stability.
Which leaves us with this one final thought. Will the 2026 election finally yield the selfless, visionary leadership that Darjeeling's residents are begging for? The people have spoken, they have a solid plan, and above all, they demand peace. Now, it's entirely up to the politicians to deliver. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I hope this gave you a completely new perspective to ponder.